Okay, well, welcome everybody. So I'm pleased to have the opportunity to have Dr. Augustine Fou with me today. My name is Lorne Solway. I'm the president of the Response Marketing Association, and we're an association that really focuses on education, networking, and advocacy for experienced and young marketers that are coming through the system right now. I also work for a company called Cognitive as a global client marketing and customer experience lead as well. And so I'm so pleased to have Dr. Augustine Fou. We're going to talk about a really interesting topic today that has all to do with ad fraud. And so I've been licking my lips, Dr. Fou, to anticipate today's session because it's such a robust topic. But maybe where we'll begin is you can tell everybody a little bit about yourself and your background.
Great. Thanks, Lauren. Glad to be here with you. I'm also a fellow Canadian. I don't know if I ever told you, but I'm a fellow Canadian living and working here in New York. I've been in digital marketing since the very beginning. So I left McKinsey and Company in '96 to get into the trenches of digital marketing here in New York. And back then, you can imagine we still had to convince marketers or big advertisers that they needed a website because a lot of them were, selling in stores, selling through catalogs and offline. So back then, it was not only helping them create the sites and then some of the marketing plans, but also, working on the strategy. Like, what do you actually use this medium for? But fast forward 25 years, a lot has changed and digital has changed a lot of marketing as well. We now have, automated systems, algorithms, and things like that. So I've kind of witnessed that entire arc of the evolution of digital marketing. And in recent years, I focused on the problem of ad fraud because it's kind of right at the intersection between marketing and the technology that's being used to place the ads. We're seeing, kind of what I would call anomalous behavior, meaning there's just way too many clicks, way too much traffic, way too many ad impressions than can be possibly generated by humans. So I've been studying this problem. But as a marketer, I've kind of seen a lot of different angles. I've been on the advertiser side at American Express. I've also worked on the agency side at both Omnicom and IPG. But the thread throughout all of that is digital. So that's who I am.
Very cool. So you're kind of like the FBI for marketers to some degree. So I had a question for you. So what prompted you to actually be proactive and become an ad fraud investigator?
Well, I kind of fell into it. I've always been analytics driven. So, as a small business owner, I did a lot of the marketing myself, actually all of the marketing. So I was one of the first people to use Google Analytics on my website, then AdWords when they came along. So all those self-serve platforms, as a small business owner, you get to go in there and build your own campaigns. So I've kind of used all those tools before. But then right after I left Omnicom in 2012, I started noticing strange things in the data, in the analytics, like click-through rates that were 30%, 50%. And just knowing, humans' behavior with respect to banner ads, a lot of humans avoid those ads and things like that, and they really don't click on them all that much, right? So when you see a 10% click-through rate, it's already suspect, right? Something's wrong with that. Why are people so interested in my ad? So when I saw that kind of data, I started asking around, like, how is this possible? Why are these campaigns getting so much, click-through rates and things like that? And people really, thought campaigns were just performing really well. And I said, something's still wrong with that. So I started building a set of tools so that I could monitor it for myself. So I kind of fell into the fraud investigation side because, as it turns out, a lot of those clicks were generated by bots. And bots are simple software programs that are not only designed to load the web pages, but they can also click on the ads as well. Because sometimes if you're just causing a ton of ad impressions and there's absolutely no clicks, the marketers will get suspicious, right? So the bots do actually click on the ads at some rate so that it makes it look like there's engagement with the ads. So then the marketers all happy and say, oh, we're getting engagement on these ads. Let's increase our investment. So it actually fueled a lot of the shifting of dollars from offline into the digital channels. But some of it's due to these incorrect metrics because of bot activity.
It's so interesting. So when you take the initiative to build these tools, as you said, to try to get underneath it a little bit, were you still working in marketing at the time? And how did you present that to, your peers and the folks that were actually in the
I had
hierarchy?
just left. Yeah, I had just left Omnicom. So, at the time I was serving pharmaceutical marketers and they were trying to do more in digital and social. There were some limitations because of regulatory constraints for pharmaceutical companies, but we were still doing a lot of campaigns online. But when I was building the tools, I wasn't specifically working for a particular company. I was on my own already. And we were using these tools to kind of think of it as audit the campaigns, right? So when we saw abnormally high click-through rates and things like that, we would start to look at, what's causing that. But even without these specialized tools, marketers can actually look at their own Google Analytics. They can look at their own AdWords account and just look for strange things. Right? I'll use one example from the pharmaceutical client. When you look at your own search campaigns and you break it out by, which domain is sending the clicks, because sometimes these domains outside of Google are running the search ads. So when you see some of these sites or domains that have 100% click-through rates, okay, something's wrong with that, right? Especially if it's not just one or two clicks, it's like hundreds or thousands of clicks. So in those cases, because these are search ads, they're being paid on a CPC basis, a cost per click basis. So in those cases, the bots actually had to click it in order to earn the money, right? So just to take a step back, there are sites that belong to the Google Search Partner Network. There are sites that belong to the Bing Search Partner Network, which means they just use Google Tech or Bing Tech to run the ads. But these are sites outside of Google and Bing itself. When someone types in a search on those sites, like WebMD, for example, some of the search results would be of that site, and then others would be sponsored results, right? These are the paid search ads. And then when someone clicks on that, the site earns a part of the revenue share, and then Google or Bing earns the other part of the revenue share, right? So in those cases, you kind of get down to the motive of the ad fraud. The bots will click on the ads so that those sites can earn the part of the CPC revenue share. So when you have unscrupulous websites, they can inflate their own revenue by using more bot traffic and create more bot clicks. But sometimes those were the greedy bad guys, right? So when we see a whole bunch of websites that had 100% click-through rates, it's very clear you can just go turn those off or block them in your search campaigns, right? So even without any specialized tools, if you analyze your own data, you'd be able to see this. But unfortunately, the biggest brands tend to not be looking at the data that closely, right? Because they typically have agencies doing all the media buying, the media placement, and stuff like that. So that's where the fraud really gets in easily.
Totally. And I think, as you rightfully said, when you and I were chatting before the session, they probably look at the vanity metrics too, and don't really go deep enough to really get an understanding of what's really performing.
I mean, sometimes they'll say, yay, we're getting a lot of clicks, or yay, we're buying billions upon billions of ads. And then they really don't question, okay, well, where are these billions of ads coming from? Because there's only 7 billion humans on Earth, and not all of them have internet connections, smart devices, and things like that. And they're not online surfing the web all day long, right? They literally have to be outside and working and stuff like that. So only a small portion of those humans can actually be online at any given time. And so that's where I also saw, when we started programmatic advertising, right? So when technology started automating the buying and selling of the ads, that's also when we saw the fraud take off, because now there's millions upon millions of sites and mobile apps that are running these ads. And in most cases, humans have never, come across these sites before, right? But yet they're selling billions upon billions of impressions. And now you can kind of understand, okay, well, a lot of this traffic is just being generated by bots instead of humans.
Yeah, totally. So some good context for us. So I want you to maybe take us back to where this all began, even chronologically. And you talked about, obviously, technology has had a huge hand in expediting this. And then if you could pivot at the end of that articulation to what's the current state of digital ad fraud today, like from a marketer's perspective?
Okay. So I'll go back a little bit in the history or chronology of the internet, and specifically internet marketing. So in the early days, you had websites, and some of the earliest ones, I think Yahoo was among the first to start putting banner ads on their sites, right? So it was kind of like a small print ad, right? Now you have a small window on the page that you can use for advertising purposes, right? So a long time ago. Now, in the early days, it was great because you now had a feedback loop that you didn't have in print or TV, right? Because now you can actually see, did anyone click on the ad, right? So you have that feedback loop called the click-through rate. So those were the earliest websites, and you had the big portals like Yahoo that aggregated all types of content like news, stock quotes, sports scores, weather, that kind of stuff. So it attracted a huge audience. So those were called the portals, and they funded themselves by doing advertising. So that was Web 1.0. Then Web 2.0 was probably, you can call it the blogging revolution, right? Where blogging platforms like WordPress and Blogger made it easier and easier for more people to get content online, right? Because originally, in the early days of the internet, you had to know HTML in order to get anything online. So most people didn't know how to do that. But then with the rise of the blogging platforms, you could basically create an account and then start writing content, and you can even put pictures in it, right, back then. So now you had a lot more people being able to put content online. So that gave rise to the early crop of blogs like Engadget, Gizmodo, and they kind of started specializing on the content, right? So they focused on technology gadgets and things like that. So then you got a little bit more specialized audiences. But again, all of this was funded by advertising, right? So they would make money through ads, but they would create the content and leave those sites open and free for visitors to come see. So they were just aggregating audiences, and the equivalent would be print magazines, right? So you had a finite audience, how many ads were being shown. So then moving on to Web 3.0, you can think of that as the rise of the social media or social networks like Facebook, Twitter, and so on and so forth, and YouTube. So again, all of those were advertising supported, but we saw a continued trend of ease of getting content online. So you don't even have to write a full blog post anymore. You can just post a picture with a few words or tweet something, right? That's 140 characters. So now you can get content online. So a lot of people are getting content online. So what this created was what we now collectively call the long tail of websites, right? So there's lots and lots of these niche websites that collectively, the theory of the long tail is that if you have enough of these small websites, it would amount to large quantities, right? So that held true for a while. But when you have so many of these small websites, advertisers couldn't go to all of them to negotiate advertising contracts, right? So it also gave rise to the ad exchanges. So the exchanges would now bring together hundreds, if not thousands, of small websites and said, oh, the advertiser, you just have to buy from one place, right? You just buy it from the exchange instead of going to each and every single website to negotiate the advertising. So the ad exchanges are very much like the stock exchange, right? So it just matches up the buyers and sellers. So Wall Street would match up buyers and sellers of shares of stock. And then the ad exchanges would just match up buyers and sellers of ad impressions. And you probably heard the term real-time bidding. Now they're literally bidding on every single ad opportunity, right? So when a human visits a web page, there's all these ad slots on the page. They'll say, oh, well, who wants to bid on this particular ad slot to place an ad, right? So then a whole bunch of advertisers would bid on that. And then whoever wins will get the right to place their ad there. And all of that happens with algorithms, and all of that happens in milliseconds. But because that is now completely automated with no human intervention, it's also created more opportunity for fraud, right? So with the rise of the ad exchanges, right, that really started taking off in 2013 or so. That's when bad guys got involved, right? So now they could actually create lots and lots of fake websites, add them into the exchange, and then start selling ad impressions. So previously, this was much harder to do because they would actually have to negotiate with an advertiser, prove to them that they had a real website so that the advertiser would pay them to place some ads. But now everything is kind of commingled together into an ad exchange. So then for the advertisers, they would just buy from the exchange and say, okay, I want to spend X millions of dollars, go place it on as many sites as possible. Again, the theory being that if we put our ads on more websites, we're going to have more opportunities to show them to humans. Unfortunately, there's not that many humans going to that many long tail websites, right? Because again, if you think about what a long tail website is, it's a site with very, very niche content. So that means not a lot of humans would be interested in that super niche content. But unfortunately for the for the advertisers, if these sites wanted more traffic, they could now go out and buy the traffic. And what that means is that, oh, well, I can go buy exactly 100,000 page views on my site because there's some guy out there selling me traffic. And they guarantee me it's real, right? But oh, well, I'm going to conveniently not ask any further questions because I want the 100,000 page views on my site because that's how I grow my revenue, right? So in that case, you can also just think of common sense, which is like there aren't a whole bunch of humans sitting around with nothing to do but to go to your specific website exactly 100,000 times. But it's trivial for a botnet to do that, right? It's literally one line of code, go hit this website 100,000 times, and the botnet will do exactly that. So that being said, we now kind of fast forward to today. So with the rise of the programmatic exchanges, yes, it was a good thing for the advertisers. They could automate the buying and selling of the ads. So it made it more convenient. But it also created a loophole for more of these criminals and fraudsters to start fake websites and sell fake ad impressions. And so that leads to your final question, which is, what's the state of ad fraud today? It's at its highest point ever. But that's kind of at odds with what most people hear, most marketers hear, when the trade associations keep telling them ad fraud is less than 1%, their programs have taken care of it, don't worry about it.
Yeah, totally. So now this is where this is going to start to get juicy and interesting. So I always say the notion of problem well defined is a problem well solved. So what exactly is the problem? And transparently, who's at fault? Like what parties are at fault? I know how we got here, but who instigated and who's propagating this right now?
Unfortunately, the way to think about this is ad fraud is not a technology problem. Ad fraud is an incentives problem. So since we have a lot of marketers in the room, I'll start with the marketers, and I'm going to blame them first, but I'll do it in a nice way. So for the marketers, what I've seen happen is basically as they started shifting dollars into digital, they were looking for greater reach and frequency. And in digital, there was the appearance that they could buy billions upon billions of ads. So, okay, wow, I can, in what other channel can I buy this many ad impressions, right? TV is finite, print is finite, radio is finite, outdoor billboards is very finite, right? So where else can I buy this many ad impressions? And furthermore, where can I buy the ad impressions so cheaply, right? Because in digital programmatic, you could get CPMs in the $1 range, $3 range, or even less than $1, right? So you can really buy tens of billions of impressions at very, very cheap prices. So that made it attractive for the advertisers to start shifting more dollars into digital. And on top of that, they saw, oh, well, we're seeing all these clicks, so it must be working, right? So that added or fueled the fire of this, what I call addiction to these digital programmatic ads. Basically now they're saying, wow, I'm getting so much engagement, meaning I'm getting so many clicks. So, we talked about the vanity metrics before, and the very simple notion in most people's mind is more is better. Okay, I got more impressions, I got more clicks, so it's got to be better, right? So they kept pouring more money into this. And so in this case, the focus has been on buying as much quantity as possible and as cheap at as cheap prices as possible. And that has actually fueled even more fraud. So in that sense, the marketer would have inadvertently fueled the fraud because they keep asking for more and more quantity. And so in fact, that's translated through the supply chain as well, because when the marketer is demanding more quantity, they're now going to say to the media agency that they use, go buy more quantity for us, right? Go get it and get me better prices, right? It's the same mentality they use in TV. But the difference between digital and TV is that in TV, there's still kind of the finite number of minutes you could use for ads, right? During any 30-minute show or an hour show. Whereas in digital, it's almost like an unlimited virtual world where you can create unlimited websites and you can create unlimited ad impressions. There's no longer that constraint of, finite number of minutes you can use for advertising or finite number of pages in a magazine that you could use for advertising, right? So we kind of dissociated ourselves from reality, if you will. And so when they force their agencies to go buy more quantity at lower prices, the only place you can do that is in programmatic exchanges. Because again, if you imagine trying to buy from a real publisher, right? Like a news site that has, like the Globe or something that has human audiences, there's a finite human audience and they look at a finite number of pages. So you can't buy more than the Globe can sell you, right? So that's why it's kind of forced the agencies to start dipping into these programmatic exchanges to try to find the quantity and try to get better prices.
But just a question on
And
this.
yeah,
Sort of interrupt you. So it's so interesting. So when you think about the chain of command in this case, right? So if a marketer, to your point, what are the vanity metrics, obviously, and it's usually senior management that wants to help understand how effective the channels are. So a marketer would go to their agency, who's their agency partner and they trust and they're expert in the area, especially on the media side. Is it the marketer who's wrong in this case, or is it incumbent upon the agency partner that are doing the media buy through the programmatic platforms to actually do their discovery and due diligence and really understand which ones actually are effective and which ones seem to be providing artificial metrics back? Or is it pretty well an impossible thing for them to be able to understand that?
no, it should be very, very easy. But it's both parties' responsibility. The marketer has to ask for it, and then the media agency has to actually do it, right? So the problem is that the marketer loves these vanity metrics. They want more impressions, more clicks, and things like that. And the agency loves that too, because the more media they place, the more money they can make off of it. So neither of them have been proactive in saying, well, even if I got a lot more traffic and a lot more clicks, it doesn't seem to be driving any business, right? Nobody wants to be the first to say that. So I've come across many marketers where, they're saying, we're getting so much more traffic these days. We're getting so much, to the websites, right? We're
I've
getting
been
so
guilty of
many
that.
more clicks, right?
Totally.
But they never ask the next question. Well, is any of that translating to more sales? Now, unfortunately, that is a hard question to ask, because if you ask that question and you find out that you're not actually getting more sales, then you have to go figure out why. But because of the pandemic, we saw a lot of marketers actually turn off budgets or pause digital budgets throughout 2020. And what I'm seeing right now is that more of the marketers are being more cautious, right, and more deliberate about what they turn back on. Now, aside from those, right, we're still seeing the ripple effects of all that. We've seen previous cases, right, and these are US-centric cases, but I'll use them to illustrate. When P&G turned off $200 million of their digital ad spending, they saw no change in business outcomes. When Chase, right, a big financial institution, reduced their programmatic, the number of sites carrying their ads from 400,000 sites to 5,000 sites carrying their ads. That's a 99% decrease. They saw no change in business outcomes. And then when eBay turned off their paid search spending in the Western US, just to run as an experiment, they saw no change in the amount of traffic coming to their site, nor the number of sales from that region, right? So they could tell the search spending, all that digital spending was not actually driving outcomes. And then the most recent example was Airbnb. During the pandemic, because people couldn't travel, they literally turned off all their digital media spends to save $800 million. And then on a recent earnings call, their CEO said, well, our site is still getting 95% of the traffic that we got in 2019 without any paid media spending. So he said that lesson is going to allow them to redeploy some of that investment instead of spending it in digital, to try to chase the clicks, try to chase the traffic. They're going to be doing more branding, more PR, and other things to expand the brand footprint, right? So that kind of gets to one of the concepts I've talked about before, which is a lot of brands are literally overspending in digital because they believe, because they're getting so many billions of ad impressions and so many clicks, that it's actually working. But they haven't taken into account the possibility of fraud, right? Which is that the banner ads are being shown to bots and not to humans. So if your ad is being shown to bots, you're not going to do any brand building at all, right? So you need to be conscious of that. And I think for a lot of the brands, the very simple thing to do is really start looking at business outcomes, start asking for more detailed reports, because I'm still blown away by how few brands actually get a detailed report that tells them which sites and apps, mobile apps, carried their ads. They usually get a rolled up report at the end of the month from their agency that says you bought this many billions of impressions and you got this many clicks and you spent this much. But they don't
Exactly.
get the granular detail of where the ads show up,
So
right? So
question,
it's not just, yeah.
quick question before I sort of interrupt you. I'm just curious. So what would you be your estimate on the percent of programmatic, maybe not the percent, the amount of programmatic spend that actually is bot driven, meaning that it's pretty well commoditized, has no value at all. You're just spending your money on nothing. Would that be 10%, 20%, 50%? Like what would you
Most
estimate?
of it.
Wow.
Most of it. No one's going to believe me anyway, and they don't have to believe me. The way I usually describe this is certain marketers that are extremely careful in their buying, right? They use very, very strict whitelist of sites and apps. They will be far less exposed to the risk of ad fraud than those that are trying to get as much quantity as possible,
Yeah, it
right?
makes sense.
So there's two schools, literally two schools of thought and two schools of media buying. There are ones that still believe that if I get way more quantity, I want to increase my reach and frequency because that's how I do branding, right? So they're literally taking that mentality into digital. But while that worked in TV, right, you increase reach and frequency, you're going to increase sales. In digital, it doesn't work well because of the problem of fraud. And that's because even if you're getting billions upon billions more ad impressions at lower cost, most of that, if it's being shown to bots, you're not going to actually be doing any brand building. So you have to kind of wean yourself from that addiction to vanity metrics and actually start delving into the analytics. Sometimes you might not be able to track it all the way through to sales, right? Especially like CPG or companies that sell in grocery stores. They'll say, "Oh, well, we don't make sales online. We sell in soda in grocery stores, so we can't track that." But yes, you can, right? You can still run those turn off experiments that P&G did or Chase did, right? To see, okay, well, if I turned off 5% of my digital spend, did I see any change in business outcomes, right? So
Yeah,
some
that's
of
one of
those
the questions that
experiments you can,
one
yeah.
of the questions that came in from the audience that I was tracking was around P&G. The time when P&G was bold enough to actually shut it off, and I don't know how many years ago. You would know better than I, Dr.
It
Fou.
was 2018, so it wasn't too long ago. But
Were
it's
they the
like,
ones
why?
that instigated this or expedited the narrative around the implication of bots? Do you think?
No, they actually some of that. So they did say that overspending in digital was not driving business outcomes. So on the one side, they did turn off some of the media, right, the digital media, but they also went on to cut a lot of supply chain costs, right? So they had so many agencies working for them. They literally cut the number of agencies in half, and so they saved a tremendous amount of cost that way. So it wasn't solely around fraud, and in fact, they never did it again. So then the question is, okay, well, after you cut 200 million, why didn't you cut the next 200 million, right? Because you want to keep cutting until you actually hit that balance point where your ads are actually driving a business outcome for you, right? But again, not every marketer can cut 200 million, but they should cut 200,000 and then see, and then just keep running that experiment.
So that's a question for you. And I would imagine it's probably on a lot of marketers' minds. So I think everyone would recognize there's a problem. I think most of us don't know how big or small that problem is. There's different schools of thought on it for sure. And I know you certainly have a strong point of view on it. But what does a marketer do? So if I'm in a mid-sized to a large company, and I've always spent a certain amount of money in certain areas of the business. I have my comparative sales that I have to drive year over year. Like, what do I do? Like, if I suspect that, even if I don't suspect it, I come out of this session and I want to take a hard look at trying to really understand, am I a victim like everybody else? Like, what do they do? Where do they start?
Well, they should join the Response Marketing Association audit,
Oh,
right?
thanks.
No, because remember we were going to offer that to them and say let's run an audit for you to take a look, because for the marketers, it's like, don't take my word for it. It's like, really just look at your own campaign, because some campaigns are well managed, so there will be relatively low fraud. Other campaigns are not closely managed, and they will be subject to a lot more. So your own campaigns will have its own characteristics. So you really have to audit your own thing. I mean, the more practical things that they can go do is ask for the analytics. So if you're a CMO, definitely ask your programmatic marketing person to show you a list of the domains and apps that are running your ads. Now, there's a couple angles to that. One is for this fraud issue, but the other is, where are your ads actually running? Is it funding fake news? Is it funding COVID disinformation, that kind of stuff? So there's more benefits than just the fraud issue to find out where your ads are running. But on the flip side, you can probably name off all of the biggest publishers in Canada, right? There's a handful of the biggest publishers here in the US that you can name off. If you just think about your own experience, humans might visit a long tail site once in a while. But if you try to name off, 10 sites that you visit regularly every day, how quickly can you do that? All right. So when I ask this question in class, most people can kind of get up to 5 to 7, 8 or whatever, and then they start slowing down. They can't even get to 10 sites that they visit regularly every single day. So you can kind of see how finite the number of humans are, and how finite the number of sites they go to regularly, right? So in that case, if you start with a very, very strict whitelist of those sites, you would have gotten your ad in front of most humans anyway, right? And so then you start to question, why am I showing my ads on these hundreds of thousands of other sites, right, that probably don't have a ton of humans? So you just kind of use that Chase example. They reduced it from 400,000 websites carrying their ads to just 5,000 sites. Now, they did that with a bunch of interns. So one summer, I think it was summer of 2018, they just had a bunch of interns manually visit sites to say, okay, well, this doesn't even look remotely real, right? So they turn those off. And then they curated their own list of 5,000 sites. So a marketer should at least get the site report, right, the placement report, to see where their ads are running, and then start culling down from there, right? And so and when they do that, just pay attention to the business outcomes. If there's no change to the business outcomes, then whether or not it was fraud, it was actually not yielding any kind of business activity for you. So why keep spending on that anyway, right?
Seems like a simple test. I had a question that came in. It's a rather good question, actually. I hadn't quite thought of this, but the question is, can bots mimic e-com sales? I feel like e-com is less susceptible to digital ad fraud in the results due to the revenue exchange and return on asset returns.
Yes, so that's a good point. And in general, because bots don't buy from you, right? So literally, they're not going to spend money. The bots are there to make money through ad fraud, right? As long as they cause the ad to load, they can make the money, or they click on the ad, they can make the money. So bots usually don't spend money. However, beware of the situation that I've seen where the bots are basically claiming credit for sales that have already happened. So let me say that again. So some of these e-commerce sales have already happened, but the bots are claiming credit for it so they can get a share of the revenue, right? So affiliate programs are designed to, once you get the sale, then we give a 5% revenue share to whoever helped drive the sale. So let me be more specific. There's a crop of companies that do retargeting or remarketing. So the idea is that if a person has bought from a site before, you would show more ads to them so that they would buy more from you. But I'll use a theoretical example. This is not the specific marketer, but I'll use a site that everyone knows, like Macy's.com. Right? So a human who has bought from Macy's.com will probably buy from Macy's.com again, right? Or Amazon.com for that matter. So those are follow-on sales that would occur, right? Those are organic sales. But the way the bots and the fraudsters trick the ad tech systems is by making it appear that they drove those sales when those sales would have happened anyway or had already occurred, right? So technically how it's done is they're injecting false clicks into the attribution platforms so that they make it appear that they caused the sale, right? Even though they did not cause the sale. So in that sense, fraud can still impact e-commerce sales, but generally the bots don't buy from you. What they're trying to do is claim credit so that they can earn the rev share on sales that have already occurred.
So interesting. So question, just going back to what we were talking about before in terms of what a marketer is to do. So if let's say I get the reports, I get a better sense of the types of sites that I'm buying, and I use the sniff test as you said, right? Which ones are long tail sites? What are sites that I normally would go to? And I think that's a good first gate. But moving forward, if I trust my agency and or I've got a specialist in my team that's going to go out and do additional programmatic buys, because I don't want to, I may try something different. Like how do I know that I'm really going to get something that's authenticated and real, and I'm not just buying bots all over again? Like how do you protect against something like that? Is there a diagnostic you can do, or on the sites in advance, or how does that work?
I call it common sense. Now, it sounds kind of frivolous here, but basically what I've seen happen in recent couple of years is that a lot of the marketers have gone out and paid for fraud detection technologies. And so they say, oh, well, if I want to figure out if some of this is bot or not, I'm going to go pay for fraud detection. And they believe that they can detect their way out of trouble. However, if you think about this for a minute, the hackers who make the botnets, they're hackers. So their job is to get around defenses, right? And avoid detection and stay hidden so that they can keep doing whatever they're doing, right? So these are the same hackers who have broken into government systems. They've broken into the bank systems and things like that. So it's trivial to make a bot evade detection. So then when you pay for these fraud detection services and they come back and tell you, oh, fraud is 0.1% or less than 1%, that makes everyone feel comfortable, right? The marketer who's paying the dollars, the agency who's buying the media, they'll all feel comfortable. But unfortunately, that doesn't mean that the fraud is low. So you still have to go back to common sense. Is it actually driving any business outcomes for you, right? So I think as more and more of the sales start occurring through the e-commerce channels as opposed to offline, right? Like the Canadian Tire example, most people are now buying through their site as opposed to visiting the store while there's still the lockdown and while they're still afraid to travel. They can actually now have a much more direct line of sight to see whether the marketing activities that they're doing in digital are leading to sales. But even if you're not selling through the e-commerce channel, there are experiments you can run, right? So you do the sniff test, you turn off some portion of the spending and see if it changes anything. And I would recommend one other thing, which is start thinking about a whitelist approach, like an include list approach, as opposed to an exclude list approach, right? A block list approach, right? Because if you think about it, there's millions upon millions of fake sites out there. And, for example, if fake site 123.com gets caught, they'll turn off that domain and they'll start up fake site 1234.com, and they've gotten around your block list. So it's an endless game of whack-a-mole to try to keep adding to a block list to try to prevent that. Whereas there's only a finite number of sites that you can think of that humans would visit regularly in large quantities. So if you start with a whitelist approach, right? So again, don't take my word for it, run the experiment. So if your current media buying is just buying on the programmatic exchanges and then trying to blacklist your way out of trouble, set up another campaign line where you use a whitelist approach and then compare the outcomes from both of those approaches. And then over time, just keep adjusting the media allocation, the budget allocation to each of those to see which one's working better to drive more business outcomes.
Great solution. It's like an A/B test to some degree, right? I have
very simple. Yes, very simple.
Another question that came in. This is regarding the Interactive Advertising Bureau, the IAB. And so the question is, what do you think of their position currently on ad fraud? And maybe you can talk a little bit about what their position is and then your point of view on it.
Yeah, I think both in the US and in Canada, their position, it's not necessarily good or bad. It's just that they believe that fraud is low and they believe that their programs have pretty much eliminated fraud to the extent that they can. A lot of that is because they are looking at the data from existing fraud detection tech companies that keep reporting 1% IVT. So IVT stands for invalid traffic. So you can think of that as bots hitting a web page, right? Traffic coming to a site. But in my mind, in my research, fraud is so much more than that, right? So now that we've moved beyond websites and we've gone into mobile apps and CTV and these other digital channels, if a flashlight app a rogue flashlight app is loading 100,000 ad impressions on your device in the background, that's not technically a bot hitting a web page. So if those technologies are not tuned for looking for all these other kinds of fraud, and they're only looking for IVT, invalid traffic, they're going to miss all this other kind of fraud. So then the trade associations, I think they're well-meaning, but when they're just citing these reports that say IVT is less than 1%, of course they will think that fraud is under control. But if they're not actively looking for all the other ways the bad guys are committing fraud and making money, then they're missing out on that. So unfortunately, they may not have the most up-to-date view of the problem of fraud, right? They do believe that fraud is low and mitigated, and advertisers don't have to worry. But I do think that advertisers should look into this themselves. And the other consideration is that the IAB is very much the trade association for the interactive ad tech companies. So they really can't say anything bad about it, right? They can't do anything to jeopardize their own members' businesses. So they're probably not going to help you dig too deeply into this fraud problem.
And how would they rationalize in your mind? And I can really understand it's a little bit of a sticky position, but how would they rationalize the fact that ad fraud is low? Like, what's the proof point? As you said, it's the one metric that
they're just relying on the fraud detection companies reports, right? So they're saying 1%, but if they're only looking for the IVT, to me, those are the bots that got caught, right? Those are the bots that are not advanced enough to bypass detection. And so there are simple things. And you can even look at, they differentiate GIVT and SIVT. So GIVT stands for general IVT versus sophisticated IVT. But all that means is that in the case of the GIVT, these are data centers, right? These are IP addresses that come from Amazon data centers, Google data centers, and humans don't access the internet through data centers. So the bots are basically browsers that are automated, right? You can spin up a whole bunch of these browsers in a server and tell them to load as many web pages as possible, right? So a bot is a very simple, what we call headless browser. So it's the same as a Chrome browser, but it's headless because it doesn't have a screen attached to it. So then you can automate thousands of browsers kind of in a virtual environment like with a server and drive a lot of traffic that way. But sometimes these bots are a little bit more advanced where they're deliberately faking the mouse movements and the page scrolling and the clicks just to trick the bot detection, right? So what I've seen in my research is that the more advanced bots are actually doing all these mimicked human interaction events in order to trick the detection. So again, if the industry trade associations are relying on fraud detection reports that only report the IVT, they're certainly going to be underestimating the total amount of fraud that's out there. So I think I would just encourage everyone, specifically the marketers, to look more closely at your own data. So even if your agency tells you it's low, even if the IAB tells you it's low, use some common sense to say, okay, well, I'm getting all this traffic and my Google Analytics tells me that they're just bouncing, right? The bounce rate is near 100% and their time on site is less than 2 seconds.
Yeah,
okay,
totally.
so, if a human actually wanted to come to your site, they probably stick around for a little bit longer than 2 seconds. So
Yeah.
then, then you'd start to peel back the onion, if you will, right? So your common sense should tell you, okay, even though they say the fraud is low, I'm still seeing something strange. And that's kind of how I started the whole, 8 years ago looking into this because the data just didn't make any sense. So then I had to look for the reason.
Yeah, I think that's great advice for anybody. So it almost sounds like proactively as a marketer, you need to be on guard to look for it, right? The same as you get hackers into your everyday life through computers,
Yeah.
mobile phones, right? It
Right. If
makes
you have malware on your phone, you don't even know it's there. Right. So a good malware maker knows how to stay hidden for as long as possible so they can keep running ads in the background. They can keep harvesting your passwords, all that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
these bot makers, we'll see occasionally these large reports that say, oh, well, there's 600 apps that are openly committing ad fraud. And, then when that gets reported to Google, Google will definitely kick them out of the Play Store. But until that gets discovered, they're actually still committing ad fraud, right? So I think the default would be, let's assume that there's risk. Let's not assume that there's no risk. And really the course of action would be to look more closely at it. Because even though all the parties mean well, they may not actually be seeing everything. So unfortunately, they may not be the best informed to tell you whether there's high or low fraud, right? But I've been studying this for a long time. There's usually some fraud and bots and malicious code hiding in the background somewhere. So as long as you take a closer look, if it's actually not there, then that's fine. Then your digital marketing programs are going to work well. Otherwise, don't assume that there's not bots eating up your precious budgets.
Yeah, totally. That's the word I was going to use, precious budget. So I have to ask this question. So I've read a little bit about this, obviously. Contentious issue, but can you talk a little bit about the role of organized crime, in the background of all these things? Like, what is their role? How they involved in this? And
It's very simple. Where there is money, they will go there and take the money, right? So if you compare this to robbing a bank, right? When you're trying to rob a bank, you pull out a gun and you risk life and limb, right? You might actually get shot and you might die. When you're committing digital ad fraud, you're just sitting at home and managing a bot net of thousands of bots, and you can create ad impressions and make money from it. So literally, the ease of it and the scalability because of programmatic technologies, right? It's like I said earlier, when we scale the buying and placing of the ads, it's also allowed the bad guys to scale and automate the fraud as well, right? So organized crime, it's not like they woke up one day and said, we got to get into ad fraud, but it's so lucrative and there's so many dollars involved now. So in the US, for example, there's about 150 billion spent per year in digital advertising. And then the number is 350 billion per year worldwide spent in digital alone, right? That's a portion of overall media. When there's that many dollars involved and it's that easy to do, right, from the convenience of your own home, it would be not a good idea to assume that organized crime is not already taking advantage, right? Because this is far easier than moving cocaine or robbing a bank or any other form of illicit crime, right? This is, and furthermore, there's the money laundering aspect to this, right? So for law enforcement, they should understand that, in other forms of crime, you still have to launder the money, right? You obtain the funds illicitly by selling cocaine or something. Then you have to launder it to make it look like legitimate, clean funds. In this case, digital advertising is both the way to make money and laundering all in one, because the cover is, oh, I just bought $1 billion worth of digital ads. No one ever saw that. It's just recorded on the books and it's clean money, right? So what I've told law enforcement is, they need to be on the lookout for the money laundering aspect of this, because they can just make it appear that, oh, well, I just spent $1 billion on digital advertising. So, there's already the convenient cover to launder the money. Not only can they make it, they can also launder it all in one step. That's the problem.
wow, amazing. And so when you think of the food chain behind digital ad fraud, the role of, and I'm just curious, like, does everybody have a little bit of guilt in this, meaning the publishers, the agencies, we talked about the marketers, like, does everybody own a piece in terms of trying to clean this up and make it better for the future?
I would say it's more the case of just looking the other way because it's convenient to look the other way. Right? So let me put it this way. I'll talk about how the money flows. So on the one side, you have the advertisers spending the money, right? So then they go to the media agencies and say, can you help me spend $100 million in digital, right? So just go and find anything you can buy. So then the media agencies go to the largest exchanges first and say, do you have enough inventory for us to buy? And then just note that the ad impressions don't exist before a person visits the web page, right? So New York Times won't know how many page views they get ahead of time. They can kind of approximate, right? So, but the ad units don't exist. So then the exchange will say, oh, well, we kind of predict we'll have this much, but we're not totally sure. But then when they are when they're about to be handed $100 million, they'll say, oh, we'll take all of it. We guarantee you we'll get you the impressions. But what if they're running light, meaning they can only spend 60 of the 100 million? Now they're in a desperate situation. They already promised to sell $100 million worth of ad impressions. They've only gotten 60 from humans visiting websites. So they are in their desperation. they have to go out and buy bot traffic so that they can hit their number. So do you see how that creates
So can I
the
ask you a
negative?
question on that?
Yeah,
Do you think they knowingly will go out and buy bot traffic? Like, are they
they
knowingly
will
doing that? Or are
knowingly
they,
go
to
out
your
and
point, are they casting the, casting the fishing rod? I've only got 60. I need to get 100. Go get me the best you can.
no, what they're doing is they're knowingly buying the traffic. They
Okay.
will deliberately not ask if it's bots or humans. But the way to think about it is, are there a whole bunch of humans sitting around with nothing to do, but they go to these specific 100,000 websites, 10 billion more times? No, that doesn't happen. But for a botnet, it's literally one line, one command, right? Go hit these sites this many times. That's trivial. So that's how this amount of traffic can be generated reliably, right? So for a normal publisher, they're just waiting for humans to come to their site, right? So they have to write good content and all that kind of stuff. They're hoping that enough humans come to their site so that they can make their number by the end of the month. But if you have overly aggressive revenue goals, right, you're essentially forcing your ad ops team, your revenue ops team to go and buy traffic because they can't hit those numbers with humans visiting the site. So do you see how there's many cases or many points in the supply chain where because of the undue pressure to make more and more revenue, it's actually creating more incentive to go out and buy the fraudulent traffic. So when they go
Yeah.
out and buy the traffic, right, anyone who's on the session can just Google the term buy traffic or buy valid traffic. And there'll be thousands upon thousands of people willing to sell you the traffic. But again, it's not traffic from humans. You can't force humans to go to your site or go to a collection of websites. So therefore, even if it's not labeled as bot traffic, it is still not humans. It's something else, right? So there's many, many techniques to generate traffic, right? You can either have a bot load a web page, or you can have the web page itself keep refreshing itself, or the ad slot itself keep reloading, right? So there's many, many ways to inflate these quantity metrics or these vanity metrics that we talked about before, right? So then, it's basically the media agencies forcing the ad exchanges to do this stuff because they just don't have enough ad impressions to sell. And then some of those large exchanges will go to small exchanges and say, oh, I'm desperate for inventory. Can you sell me something? And then sooner or later, it gets down to the site owners, right? And so some of these sites, the long tail sites, don't have enough humans visiting. So what do they do to increase their revenue? Go buy bot traffic.
Of
So
course.
then ultimately at the very end of this whole chain, there's a handful of bot makers that maintain vast botnets that can be used for this purpose, right? So these botnets that were previously used for DDoS attacks, right? Distributed denial of service attacks. These botnets are so vast, they can overwhelm even the largest sites with so much traffic that they fail. That wasn't lucrative, right? That wasn't a very lucrative way of using the botnets. Now they can point the traffic fire hose to some sites that pay them for the traffic, right? So it's kind of like renting time on that botnet. So whichever website, doesn't have this moral boundary to say, oh, well, it's okay for me to just buy some traffic because no one's complaining anyway, right? They'll just go and buy the traffic and they can literally manufacture as many ad impressions out of thin air as you want to buy. So going back to, when we dissociated ourselves from the physical world, like TV ads, print ads, and billboards, now in the digital world, there are unlimited websites, right? Like I said, fakesite123.com gets caught. They'll start up fakesite1234.com. And literally I've seen in the data, just alphanumeric, right? Letters and numbers, 36 characters long. No human would ever type that in to go to that site, but yet that's a different site. So unless you have that in your block list, it's getting by. So that's how the sheer quantities can be generated because we no longer have the physical constraints of the physical world. These are just bits and bytes flying around. And unfortunately for the advertiser, it ends up being Excel spreadsheets that they get at the end of the month. So in the case of Uber, let me finish off with that case. They were spending about $150 million in mobile to try to get more app installs, right? So they wanted more people to install the Uber app. As it turns out, those app installs were faked by the mobile exchanges. So now Uber is suing 100 mobile exchanges for fraud. And what that means is that not only were the mobile exchanges falsifying the placement reports, right? They were just altering the data to say these ads ran on good websites when they actually ran on porn sites or whatever. And then in some cases, they were fabricating those placement reports entirely. So they didn't even run any ads, but they just made up the reports so that it appears that this many ads ran on this many sites and they got this many clicks. Now, when Uber turned off their spend, the way they discovered all this fraud was that they turned off the spend. So they turned off 4/5 of their $150 million spend, so about $120 million. And they said, oh, well, the app installs kept going. So those are what we call organic installs. So those are people who would have installed the Uber app anyway because they wanted to, not because they saw an ad and clicked on it. So what these mobile exchanges were doing was basically claiming credit for app installs that had already happened. So it's very similar to the e-commerce question we had before, which is the sales would have happened anyway, or the sales had already occurred. But then by tricking the attribution or the analytics platforms, they made it look like they caused the sale. So the reason the mobile exchanges were doing that is Uber was paying between $5 and $10 per completed app install. So every time they could show that an app was installed because of them, they would get paid that cost per install. So now they just had to make it look like they drove a ton of installs, right? And they were actually just claiming credit for installs that had already happened. So that's how scammers work. They just create the illusion of it. So until Uber turned that off, they would not have, if they didn't turn it off, they wouldn't have seen it.
I wouldn't
Right?
know. Yeah, totally. It's a push and pull fraud ecosystem. It's
Yeah.
unbelievable. I have another quick question for you. I'm just curious on your perspective. So obviously, this is a geographic agnostic issue overall. But if you think about it from a global standpoint, are there some markets that are more predisposed to ad fraud than others? So I would cite Canada versus the US, US versus Europe, the UK. Like, what would your perspective on that be? Or is it the same everywhere?
I think the risk is the same everywhere, meaning the bad guys are going to steal money wherever they can steal money. But I would actually say there might be certain geographic regions where the marketers tend to be a little bit more conservative. In the US, we have, there's two phenomena. One is watching sports where the bigger number wins, right? The higher the score, the winner. So it's like, oh yeah, let's go buy 10 billion more because we can. So bigger numbers is always better in people's minds. And then the other is what I call the Costco mentality, right? So we're used to buying bulk toilet paper at lower unit price at Costco. So because we have this in our minds, it's like, oh, well, let's go buy digital ads that way. Let's go buy more quantity at lower unit price. Literally, that's what's happening. So in the US, we have these kind of societal factors that are driving more marketers to just buy more quantity at lower unit price. Doesn't mean they're doing better digital marketing. So hopefully more of them will be more deliberate, more careful in terms of what digital budgets they turn back on. And then also going forward, be a little bit more careful at looking at their own analytics to see if there's still something strange. And then if they're open to it, let's go do an audit right together so that we can actually look at the data and say, okay, are you exposed to this kind of risk of ad fraud?
It's so interesting. We do talk a lot at the RMA about response marketing efficacy. And we probably haven't paid enough attention to this topic, right? Because obviously this has a profound impact on the real performance of your spend, and especially as digital ad budgets are growing so significantly, right? So to your
Yeah,
point,
and I think
yeah,
yeah, like the concept of correlation versus causation, right? So very often they're spending in digital, like you're saying, and the sales are happening. So there's a rough correlation between the spending and the sales,
you
but they
don't
didn't
look.
make the effort to really draw the line between causation, right? So one of the things would be to run those turn-off experiments that I talked about. But the other thing would be to also look at the analytics to see, if there's bot activity impacting that, because some of those sales might have already occurred, right? It wasn't because of the digital marketing. But the other thing is you could be getting way more sales for the same digital spend if you actually made sure that less and less of those ads got shown to bots anyway. So there's a couple of benefits over time that they can realize from doing a little bit closer homework on this.
Yeah, totally. I think that's great guidance. So unfortunately, we're out of time. I actually wish we had another couple of hours.
All right.
It's such an interesting
Thank you.
area, and it's such an area that's so I don't think it's well understood by marketers, and I don't think it's well understood just by the general population. But to your point, it seems like a bit of an underground economy, and I think we'll have to go deeper into it. So, on behalf of all of us, Dr. Augustine Fou, thank you. It was so
Thank you.
insightful. We appreciate you taking the time, and look forward to connecting with you further on the topic.
Great to chat with all of you.
Have a great
Bye.
day. Stay healthy.
Thank you. You as well.
Bye, everybody.